All right. Welcome, everybody, to the second of CWI's ongoing webinar series. It's 10:03. I'm going to give it just another couple seconds here to let people file in, and then we will get started. So thanks for sitting tight. Okay. I'm impatient. It's not one of my virtues, so dive on in. Happy Wednesday to all of you joining us out there, and of course to our panelists. My name is Marissa Christensen. I am the Executive Director of the Climate and Wildfire Institute, also known as CWI. And I am here in a slowly calming down Los Angeles. So I think that this conversation is certainly well-timed, and I'm excited to get into it. So CWI, if you're not already familiar, was formed to accelerate solutions to the era's most pressing climate and wildfire challenges, which sounds great, but what does that mean? For us, it means that we bridge the gap between research and tech and the field practitioners and policymakers that can be helped or informed by it. We would not be at this stage, of course, without our partners across the public, private, nonprofit, academic, tribal sectors. So thank you to all of them and all of you for continuing to support us. One of the primary roles that we play is the role of convener. And one of the ways we do that is webinars like these. So thank you once again for joining this webinar, and I hope you guys will all come back and join us again. I'm going to pause here and just give my team a sense of who is in the room. We cannot see you. You can only see us. But Helen is going to be dropping a poll in the chat, so please just take a minute to fill that out. Okay. Thank you so much. Very nice. We have a really good turnout. I'm excited. Okay. So speaker introductions. We now have a sense of who you are, and only fair that you should know who we are. So for many communities, the recent fires here in Los Angeles have recast the spotlight on wildfire preparedness and response. Fire simulation and modeling tools are particularly critical to these efforts insofar as they help simulate or predict fire behavior and inform an appropriate response. However, these tools can be limited by their accuracy, simplicity, or difficulty to scale, among other challenges. AI and machine learning are helping advance these tools, enabling researchers like the ones here today to better understand, predict, and respond to wildfires. So today, the experts that we are joined by include Dr. Jaslyn Hall, Dr. Hussam Mahmood, and Dr. Ching Wang. They're going to offer all of their unique insights from their unique vantage points as we continue to face the challenges of the day together. So I'm going to get into just a really brief bio for each of you, and then we'll dive into the conversation. Dr. Hall is a research associate at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, where she focuses on measuring, understanding, and predicting how forests respond to disturbances such as hurricanes, fires, drought, logging. Dr. Mahmood is the George T. Abel Professor in Infrastructure at Colorado State University, where he researches sustainable and resilient infrastructure and communities, emphasizing detailed models to capture damage to the built environment and the impact of human influence and socioeconomic policy on infrastructure recovery. And Dr. Wong is a software engineer at Google Research, where he explores and develops computational fluid dynamics libraries based on modern high-performing computing architectures, which can be applied to high-fidelity modeling of simulations, weather, and climate-related phenomenon, such as wildfires. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us here today. Obviously, reading those bios, you're all very busy, so we appreciate it. Okay, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We also have a few of my CWI colleagues here on with us who are supporting in behind the scenes. Helen is going to continue to share relevant resources and links in the chat, so you can keep your eye on that. And also, we would love for you to submit your questions in the chat, which you can do so throughout the whole conversation. We will try to get to as many of them as possible, probably within the last 10-15 minutes of this webinar. If we don't get to your question, you can submit them to info@climateandwildfire.org, and we will work on getting you a response. So with that, we're going to jump in. I have a whole series of questions for each of you and all of you. So with that, Dr. Hall, I would love to start with you. At the Carey Institute, you're comparing forest carbon outputs from DynaForest, a state-of-the-art forest and fire simulation model, against outputs from forest inventory data to validate the effectiveness of the simulated results. Could you share a bit more about your work and how machine learning helps inform and track these simulations?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's still, I mean, as many of you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty around what fire will look like in coming decades. So we need accurate predictions of both fire and forest to be able to manage the landscape in a way that really prepares us for future climate changes. And to get to good predictions, we also need accurate estimates of the historical impacts of fire on forests. I'm part of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, or WFRIC for short, which is composed of multiple teams of interdisciplinary researchers that are tackling this problem from different angles with different sets of expertise. So my WFRIC colleagues actually created DynaForest, which, as you said, is a simulation model that gives us the ability to project future fires and forest characteristics. But we want to make sure that those projections are reasonable. We've been using the Forest Service FIA field inventory data to check the model outputs for the historical period to make sure that predictions are on the right track. And the FIA is a really wonderful data set with tens of thousands of plots across the Western US. But in the end, this data set is really only giving us field values for plot locations themselves across the West, when what we want is values across entire landscapes. So what I'm doing specifically is generating a landscape level estimate of forest carbon, which I'm separating into live and dead pools. And this product won't just be a static map, it'll be an annual map for every year since the 1980s, so across the entire Landsat record. And I'm doing this using machine learning to relate the FIA field-based data set to remote sensing values from Landsat to create a wall-to-wall forest carbon map. My colleagues are also using similar methods to map out total carbon and other fuels characteristics. And ultimately, I'll be using these carbon and fuels maps to test what impacts past fires have had on forests. And with these maps and the insights that they bring, it also means that we can evaluate our own tools and improve our DynaForest projections. So what these maps in general mean is that we'll have these full spatial coverage products of predicted forest carbon and fuels characteristics for the last few decades that can be used to plan or evaluate management efforts. So for example, it could identify areas with really high dead forest carbon pools that might be good to prioritize for fuels treatments. And it also means that we can use DynaForest to start testing out different management scenarios to project the long-term impacts of fire in forests. And we can be consistently improving the model as new Landsat data becomes available.
That is great. Super helpful and interesting. Just out of curiosity, will these maps be available to others to potentially use in their research?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm currently in the process of generating the maps, and by the end of the year, I'm hoping to have them published and openly accessible to any and all that would like to use them.
Wonderful. Well, let us know how we can help to promote that and get that out.
Thank you.
So this brings us to an important question about the tools we use to study wildfires themselves, such as these maps. Dr. Wong, Firebench. It's a simulation data set designed to advance wildfire research by simulating controlled fire spread scenarios. It's noted on your website that high-fidelity wildfire simulations are computationally expensive, making it challenging to generate a comprehensive data set for a systematic parametric study. That is a mouthful. what makes current models so computationally expensive, and what makes this data set so effective in overcoming that challenge?
Thanks for the great question. So I think this question can be considered into two parts. The first part is to answer why these simulations are super expensive. So to answer this, we have to approach from the physics of the wildfires. As we all know, wildfires exhibit a vast range of dynamic scales. While a typical wildland fire can spread across tens of kilometers, the actual combustion process occurs at sub-meter scales. This creates a significant challenge in modeling and understanding wildfire behavior, as the simulation must capture both the large-scale spread and the small-scale combustion processes. So furthermore, the physics underlying wildfires are incredibly complex. Atmospheric dynamics, including wind patterns, temperature gradients, all play crucial roles in this wildfire spread. The chemical processes of combustion are also intricate, involving a series reaction that releases heat and generates various byproducts. Additionally, the interaction between the fire and the surrounding environments, including the vegetation, the topology, further complicates the entire dynamics. So to address all these challenges requires sophisticated modeling approaches that can be accounted for the multi-scale nature of the wildfire and the complex interplay of the physics and chemical process. So here it comes to the second part of the question. So what makes this dataset, or what makes the tool that we developed so efficient? So the tool we developed, SwirlLM, is a simulator that optimizes performance on the tensor processing units platform and outperform the existing, it's developed targeting, optimized on this tensor processing unit TPU platform. I'm not sure whether you heard about it. It's advanced AI-based computational platform compared to the classical CPUs. So this set of, we try to leverage the advantage of this new hardware accelerator to overcome the existing challenges. Leveraging the TPU's advanced tensor processing units, the computational power and the communication features, our simulations are significantly more efficient than the classical CPU-based methods. The Firebench dataset demonstrates SwirlLM's efficiency and considers a broad range of propagation properties. This allows the researchers studying similar aspects of the wildfire to use it directly without having to run through this kind of expensive physical simulations.
Thank you for walking us through that. So it's clear that we're working at really fine scales and the complexity of capturing that. By providing high-resolution data that researchers can use to better understand these fire atmospheric interactions, Firebench is obviously tackling a critical gap in wildland fire research. Now, Dr. Mahmood, many wildfire propagation models focus on wildland fires. Dr. Mahmood, your research, on the other hand, explores modeling approaches for quantifying how wildfires spread through communities themselves. Part of your work leverages deep learning, a type of machine learning inspired by the structure of the human brain, to automate the extraction of building and vegetation features in your wildfire spread model. How did you determine what processes needed to be automated, and why were they worth prioritizing? And these two-part questions, apologies, how does your research help inform urban planning and community preparedness strategies in areas with high fire risk, which I think is particularly important to LA right now? That's sort of where the conversations are.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. So we started the work about 8 years ago, and to the great points that were made, we were trying to develop a model that is computationally efficient, that captured the physics of the problem without having to deal with the complexity of doing computational fluid dynamics and spending too much time running one single simulation on a house and few trees. One of the things that became obvious to us at the beginning is that in order for us to understand how communities as a whole behave in wildfire events and how the built environment withstands these events, you have to actually model the entire community, because the vegetation and the built environment are both connected as a network. I can't just look at one single building and say, here's my answer for the whole community. It doesn't make sense. So we wanted the computationally efficient model, but then comes the question of data. So we actually we used the concept called graph theory. Essentially, you model the fuel, whether they're buildings or vegetation, in your community as nodes, and then you're connecting them with edges or links that describe the physics of the interaction, not just between adjacent nodes, but even nodes that are far away, a few miles down the road. And then the physics of the fire propagation goes into the links that connects all these nodes. Now, in order for us to actually calculate the different physical aspects of the propagation, whether it's ember or convection or radiation between two different surfaces, we need to get data on material. And that is obviously a problem. As we were developing the model, we started to hit the wall of where are we going to get the data from. And we've seen really wonderful efforts initiatives that are taking place by many organizations and companies and startups that try to look into kind of data collection, at least when it comes to building characteristics and defensible space fuel types and so on. Some of it is very labor intensive. You go there and you walk around and you inspect and you write what you see. So we wanted to develop something that we can either use ourselves, or we can even outsource to people in the community, so we can engage them in what people call community science. And so the deep learning model that we developed allows us to engage with people living in communities. They can walk outside with their phones and then just turn on the video or even the camera. It doesn't have to be video, and snap pictures, and it gets uploaded to a system that processes these and just tells us exactly what's there in terms of building material characteristics, window types, roof material, fuel in the defensible space, whether it's a couch or a table or a bush of some sort. And so that's a very important element that we've managed to develop. And of course, the challenge comes with who collects the data. Are people going to want to do that? And we understand the social aspects that comes with that. But from a data collection perspective, this automates the process significantly, and all this data gets fed into our graph model for determining vulnerability.
Incredible. And I think, the time is right for leveraging citizen science, community science, as you say. And I also think in moments like these, where we're seeing, a devastating wildfire or wildfires at scales and speeds that we haven't previously seen going through communities, people are,
Right.
I would imagine, pretty motivated to help with something like this. And so are your end users those folks, or are your end users, agencies that can sort of plan?
So actually, the end users are many. I mean, there has been some discussion with insurance companies. Insurance companies are running into some sort of challenges related to how to price wildfire risk, determining which building will ignite or survive. Of course, when we did our initial analysis with this, we tried to kind of determine the probability of survival or damage, and then we tried to turn that into 0-1 values, whether damaged or survived, kind of comparing to historical events. But of course, if you're trying to make decisions, you want to have a probabilistic map that tells you what's the likelihood of, surviving or being damaged. And insurance companies can use it. Policymakers at the community level can use it. And to your point that you made earlier, here, Mercer, is that other people that can use it that deal with urban planning. So if you're designing a new community, then the question is, how should that community be designed? Because what we do with the model, actually, we're actually working on the LA fire right now. And we're not designing a new community, although, of course, there need to be a new design now that they have to rebuild. But then we're working the problem backwards to say, what should be done where, which fuel should be reduced in the wildland and in the community, and which home should be hardened, and where, and what type of hardening to lower the vulnerability for the whole community. So you can work it backwards that way to determine mitigations in the wildland and community, or you can come and say, I have an empty piece of land, tell me what I should and should not do in terms of spacing between homes, the orientation relative to each other, the direction relative to the wind, the material type, the fuel, the trees, and everything in between. And the nice thing about the model is that it doesn't suggest that every single tree should be chopped or every single home should be hardened. That's going too extreme. That it might not be necessary at all in many cases.
That's fantastic. And as a Angelino, I hope that the agencies here are ready to take in this type of counsel and information. So thank you for your work. Dr. Hall, I have kind of sticking with this theme around really granular location-specific data. How do you evaluate whether your baselines are generalizable across different ecosystems and also addressing local wildfire dynamics?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're developing our models pretty specifically for the Western US, and we don't currently plan to use them to scale to other regions. But the Western US is itself pretty incredibly heterogeneous. So even keeping our study area to that region poses a unique set of challenges. Dynaforest itself is designed to capture the nuance and diversity of forest ecosystems across the Western US, and it has varying parameters for species groups and regions, so it models them separately. As for the carbon maps, I'm taking a variety of approaches to ensure transferability and scalability. The first is essentially to run separate models for each ecoregion, which are essentially just sub-regions of the Western US that have similar vegetation and climate characteristics. By using this method, we can have a pretty clear idea of how accurate our carbon predictions are for each region, and we can evaluate what the main drivers of carbon are in each area using interpretable AI techniques like SHAP values and partial dependence plots. And the other strategy then is to include ecoregion and other environmental variables like topography and climate regimes, et cetera, as variables in a global model that predicts carbon for the entire study area, so the entire Western US. Then that gives the model a clue that the carbon in one ecoregion might have a different response to, say, elevation or precipitation than carbon in another ecoregion. And here is, again, I think where the FIA data set is really helpful for addressing this variability. We can group the FIA field data by ecoregion, as well as by other variables like slope and soil type and a bunch of others that will help us gauge how well the models, including both Dynaforest and my carbon prediction model, are performing, giving observed values and where the limits are. But one big limit to, I think, most machine learning models, which maybe Dr. Mahmoud and Dr. Wong would have a better idea of as well, is that for the most part, I think that you're limited to the ranges of carbon values and predictors that are seen in the data. So we can't necessarily extrapolate out to forest carbon values that are greater or lesser than what's already been measured for a given region. And I think that's why broad and long-term data sets like FIA are so important. The data is extensive enough that we can have pretty high confidence that we're capturing the range of variability found across the West. So ultimately, yeah, I think we're quite well prepared to scale to the Western US, but I don't necessarily think that our models in their current form would be scalable to other far-off regions with unique fire and forest regimes like Australia or Italy or something similar.
Sure. Still, though, pretty incredible to be able to predict carbon dynamics with such precision, even in the West. We certainly need it here. Dr. Wong, looking to the future, based on your own research at Google, as well as what you're seeing across the industry, what emerging AI or machine learning techniques hold the most promise for revolutionizing fire modeling in the near future, and why?
I would say all the approaches that both Dr. Hall and Dr. Mahmoud has been working on are great approaches, utilizing AI to help to advance or mitigate the wildfires and for the fire and also for the fire management. They're all great AI models. They gave very great examples on how AI can help the wildfire community to improve the situation here. And as we have improved, the AI can be very helpful in multiple things. And another very important aspect from my point of view is like it can help to improve the efficiency and the accuracy of the fire predictions. So despite of the significant accelerated simulation empowered by the advanced computational architecture, as we talked about previously, like the what Swirl LM can do in simulating the wildfires in high fidelity, it is still very challenging for this kind of high fidelity simulations to provide faster than real-time predictions. This is a very big limitation on this kind of model. But in practice, we need a tool that can make fire spread predictions to be at least 10 times faster than real time, so that the fire managers can optimize the strategy and planning for the firefighting. So for this purpose, an ML model that is pre-trained on high fidelity simulation data set is a very good candidate for this problem. So compared to classical methods, This type of model will be able to capture the effect on the fire propagation due to the complex dynamics of the fire-atmosphere interaction, which is not fully captured by the classical models. Most importantly, given that the advantage of these pre-trained ML models are faster or super fast during the inference time, we're able to make real-time predictions of the fire operations. So we gain this benefit of fast prediction of the fire and the accuracy by capturing of the fire dynamics. Well, in addition to these fire prediction, ML models can also be very, very helpful in various other aspects. For example, like the field classification based on the satellite images, and also the field boundary identification, the real-time identification of the boundary to keep track of how the fire propagates, and making use of these information is very helpful to predict how the fire is going to go in the next steps. And these are all very helpful for the firefighting strategy optimization.
That's great. And for firefighting strategy, are you also talking to field practitioners and using them for sort of test cases?
Yes, this is what we have been given the feedback from the fire practitioners, where they usually, what they do is like they run through their simulation tools multiple times and just quantify, considering different situations, and make some planning and write a report and hand it over to the firefighters in order to show them how the fire is going to go in the next day, what are you expecting in the next hour, and where should you set the repellents in order to fight the fire most efficiently.
Incredible.
That's
Yeah,
what we are shooting for.
that's great. I think that feedback loop is really crucial. So I have a question for all three of you. It's about the catastrophic wildfires here in LA as sort of the backdrop. It's top of mind for many of us. I think most of us here on this webinar, whether you're in the audience or a panelist, you've probably been watching the situation closely. Are there new opportunities or risks that you see emerging for AI and machine learning to counter devastating impacts like the ones we've seen here in Los Angeles? And similarly, any lessons learned for how this technology can be deployed in real time in the future? Dr. Hall, I'm going to pick on you first.
Sure. So my WIFRI colleagues at UCLA recently released a report of an analysis they did, which suggests that these fires are essentially a function of four things, right? Which are many of the sort of usual suspects for fires in the West. You know, the first is a wet period from 2022 to 2024 that caused this buildup of fuels. The second is, you know, immediately following the wet period is a very dry and warm period that caused the fuels to dry out. The third being climate change, causing the fuels to dry out more than they would have otherwise. And the fourth being those really high speed Santa Ana winds that were higher than most Santa Ana winds were generally. So I think knowing those things are really important for modeling future fires and looking at these relationships and looking at community preparedness. But I think for the LA fires specifically, you know, once they started, my initial impression is that the real need that exists is for firefighters and citizens to have information and resources that are available at really fine timescales, as Dr. Wong was saying. That information also needs to be communicated pretty rapidly and efficiently. And I suspect there's been some lessons learned in community preparedness and communication and real resource allocation, but I must say that's not necessarily my field. I can say from the remote sensing perspective, there aren't currently very many data sets available, or really any, that are available to monitor fires at the really fine timescales that are needed to make such quick decisions. There are some daily high resolution remote sensing data sets like Planet, for example, that may have proven useful in this situation. But I think that one big opportunity I know of is FireSat. And that's an Earth Fire Alliance program that has a team launching a preliminary set of satellites called FireSat that I think would monitor fire spread and activity and have a new estimate every 15 minutes. And I'm not sure if the full constellation of satellites is funded yet, but I do think it would be huge for firefighting on the ground. And I think it would enable fire behavior modelers like Dr. Wong to use this real-time data, as Dr. Wong was saying, to make predictions. And as an ecologist, you know, this fine resolution data, I think, would help us disentangle the relationships between fire characteristics at any given time along the fire perimeter and the subsequent impacts that it has on ecosystems. So it would let us look retroactively at fires once they've occurred to really better model their spread and impact so that our projections of future fires are improved.
Incredible. Yeah, definitely excited for FireSat as well. And so, Dr. Mahmood, I mean, I want you to answer the same question. And also, I'm wondering, when it comes to fire behavior and sort of the granularity that you're talking about being sort of property by property, what we saw in the LA fires was a massive ember cast. You know, these were embers that were being spread across the landscape for up to 2.5 miles in some cases. Is there a way, using kind of a combination of all your models, to in the future be able to predict where those embers are going to land and sort of get ahead of it?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with, first of all, with Jaslyn's comments on, using satellite images and trained to kind of, tweak models and understand what's happening real time. I think that's one of the main, in my opinion, main opportunities for AI to kind of, help. Because when we look at the problem, of course, we're trying to minimize damage to communities, but we also want to make sure we evacuate people safely, get them out of harm ways. And so that real-time data and real-time updating of the models that are computationally fast, Dr. Wang said, I think become very important. From a modeling perspective, I should clarify that when we initially developed the model, we developed the model for wildfire propagation in communities, which take us into consideration interaction between vegetation and also homes, and also vegetation and homes, right? So vegetation to vegetation, structure to structure, and then vice versa. We've pushed the model more recently so that it can actually also start propagation anywhere in the wildland, all the way inside communities. So those two things we can actually get out of the model is what is the entire fire boundary would look like, starting from whatever point or line or locations in the wildland, and then inside that boundary, what would be the damage to the buildings in that area. And part of the analysis, to your point, where ignition happens and how far the fire is progressing determines how much ember cast. In our model, we actually model the ember cast, how far it goes, and if it runs against any obstacles, where would it drop and ignite versus, what is the path of that ember cast as a function of the wind, the direction, and wind speed, and so on. So it's all included in the model. We've also managed to push the model so that actually it's giving us not just damage, but it gives us damage predictions over time. And right now we're working with a couple communities on, we're in early stages of talking to them about using the model for firefighting and evacuation purposes. Because if you know how the fire is going to propagate in the wildland and inside community, then you can establish evacuation routes that helps people get out as soon as possible, overlaying transportation and road networks on top of the fire propagation model, and so on. So there are many opportunities, in my opinion. I will also mention, as incredibly sad as it was, of course, to see these LA fires unfold, I think researchers across not just the US, across the world, see them as an opportunity to learn more and try to help more in the future. We've ran our model. Initially, we built a model for the Eaton fire, and we got extremely good results. Again, the model is showing, and it helped us. What helped us in this sense is that we know that in general, there was no mitigations that were done. In general, everything is ignitable, more or less. There's fuel in the defensible space. So we didn't need to have very high resolution data, as you mentioned, at the single building level. We assumed everything is ignitable and people have ignitable fuel in their backyards and defensible space. We got really, really good accuracy in terms of predicting what would survive versus not. So there's a lot of issues that we have to think about in terms of the granularity between the different data sets that you need for your models, and what are the utilities, what you can use it for. You can cast the embers and understand structure to structure propagation and vegetation to vegetation and so on. So we'll continue to push with the model, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to help communities in the future.
I'd like to quickly, sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to quickly echo on what Dr. Mahmood has just mentioned about. So the modeling of the home properties is very important, actually. It's critical to this kind of fire, especially given why this LA fire is so devastating compared to other wildfires. because it's caused a lot of loss in economic loss and ecological loss, and caused the human deaths. So this is because the nature of the fire is slightly different from the one that has been more well studied, like the wildland fires. This is kind of classified as an urban fire, which is less well studied in terms of modeling. So this is one of the very important part that all wildfire modelers may want to put more focus on for both the AI modeling and the high fidelity modelers. Yeah, I just want to quickly echo on this point.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have to say, obviously it's been a little doom and gloom here in Los Angeles, and listening to all of you talk about just the lessons learned that just the three of you have, and what might be possible in the future really gives me hope. So thank you. With that, I think this might be a good moment to check in on audience Q&A. And we can always jump back into the questions that we have prepared for you all. But why don't we turn it over to the audience? Any questions for our panelists? Let's see. Okay, I have a question from Greg Sullivan. Thank you for your research and efforts. Is it possible to transpose your efforts to actionable data for firefighters on the scene, which is sort of what we were just talking about, of a wildfire or a brush fire? What's the timing for you all in being able to do that?
Well, I would say from our end, it's just a matter of partnership. We're working heavily now with 2 communities in Colorado that are so incredibly keen on pushing this forward. The answer would be definitely yes. One of the things we've been thinking about, because now we can actually model fire propagation over time, and we actually did Lahaina, and for Lahaina there was data. By the way, data on fire propagation in communities are also very limited, but there was an incident report that was published that includes not a lot of data, but good enough that allows us to compare how the propagation over time that we've developed compares with the time progression of the fire in Lahaina, and we got really good results as well. Now, what we are hoping to do, and we're working with as I mentioned, 2 communities in Colorado here, is to be able to use that model to establish ways of evacuation, but also what would be the safest way to fight the fire. I mean, there's, of course, some rules that, a single person cannot stand and fight the fire by themselves. It would be dangerous. And if you, for example, hypothetically, if there are 3 homes around you that are on fire, then you have to retreat. So we're developing an agent-based model coupled with our fire dynamic propagation model to determine what would be the best way to fight the fires. And now this type of models can actually be linked with actual on-the-scene firefighting activities, where we're getting real-time data. Imagine the firefighters, which they do have something that indicates their location, like a GPS or something, right? Then the model comes back and says, here where the firefighters are located, here's what the model is suggesting the next move would be to fight the fire that is coming based on the model predictions. And of course, the firefighters' experience and expertise will also inform the model. So you're using them both together real time to update your model and then determine the next steps for fighting the fire and evacuation. So we're not too far. We just it's a matter of collaboration and working with people to get this out there.
And are you looking for other communities to pilot this with?
We definitely are. I mean, right now we're working on developing mitigation strategies for about 15 communities across the US. And so we're actually doing a very large scale analysis at the county level to determine what is the vulnerability and what mitigations could be done where. In terms of the evacuation and the firefighting, we're only starting that with 2 communities only, but we're definitely looking to do more on that for sure.
That's great. And we've brought up evacuation and just community safety and communication a couple times, and I would be remiss in not plugging Watch Duty for anybody out there who somehow has missed this app. It certainly was a sort of sanity and lifesaver in Los Angeles these past couple of weeks. We have another question from Konstantinos. How easy is it to run Firebench on our computers, and do we need extensive knowledge of machine learning and computer science? So how user-friendly and layperson-friendly is this?
Yeah, I guess this is a question for me. So Firebench is a data set alone. You don't have to run anything. It's a data set already generated. So we have open sourced this data set, full data sets. All this a little bit big. It's 1.36 petabytes. We save it on Google Cloud Platform, and everyone can have access to it. So we use this data set to host one of the workshops to engage in AI and machine learning developments last year, hosted by our collaborator from Stanford. Well, we have a good engagement of different teams with contributions for different models to degenerate some, making use part of the data set to develop some fire prediction model on two-dimensional. So I believe that is very, the data set is very accessible. Although the size is a little bit big, but we have been using some machine learning technology to make it very accessible and very efficient way. So I think the answer is yes, you can get access to the data sets with your computer, and feel free to try out different things. And for the second part of the question, whether you have to have extensive AI and machine learning knowledge in order to use the data set, I think the answer is no. Because this is a high-fidelity simulation data set. It contains nothing but physical information of the flow field. So you can make use of your physical information. Depending on the purpose you want to use the data set, you can use, for example, if you can use the data set to see whether you can develop a model for the large eddy simulation closures on how the fire interacts with the atmosphere. And these are very beneficial to the community as well.
That's really good to hear. Thank you so much. A couple more questions here from the audience. Miriam says, thank you. Can you explain the general process that you use to decide when your model results are good enough to be applied on the ground?
Yeah, assuming this is a general question. I'll start and mention for our model. We ran the model against few historic wildfire events, the Camp Fire, the Marshall Fire, the Lahaina wildfire, and so on. And our accuracy varies somewhere between 72, 74% to 85%. Of course, there's the visual accuracy. You look at it, you say, oh my God, it looks really great. And then you calculate the actual number. In our personal opinion, if we're communicating the results in a probabilistic way, what's the probability or likelihood of something happening? I think 70% and higher sounds amazing in my opinion, because you can still use the model to understand areas that are, maybe what we call hotspots, areas that require attention. In general, if I do mitigation in these areas, then I lower the vulnerability for the whole community by this much. So in our opinion, an accuracy of 70% and higher is actually extremely promising. For the wildfire propagation, over time, the time aspect of it and when the fire kind of reaches specific location also becomes very important. And when we did this for the Lahaina, because it was the only data that we could compare with, there's no other fire propagation data over time, we got extremely good results as well. I think the overall propagation time was about 4 hours, and in our analysis it was like 4 hours and 15 minutes or something like that. So we're very close also with the propagation over time. We continue to improve, of course, the model, but for the purpose of making decisions and coming up with mitigation and evacuation strategies, I think this is considered very acceptable.
I think maybe I can jump in as well and say, well, in ecology, an R squared of 0.7, so 70% of the variability being accounted for is huge, right? It's like almost unheard of, really, just because there is often so much variability. So I guess in my own specific work, I'm modeling carbon and not necessarily working at the timescales that are as fine as Dr. Mahmood and Dr. Wong are. So I think that there's sort of fewer potentially disastrous consequences that occur with making sure that a model is good. So I don't necessarily view it as like, when do I decide if it's good enough? It's just that I feel a responsibility to report how good it is, essentially, and to report the uncertainty in the predictions of my model. So being able to say, I think that the carbon value in a certain area could range from this value to this value, and I'm this percentage confident in my predictions, I think is essentially empowering others to be able to use that product and to propagate that uncertainty throughout their own models and research as well.
And I probably also want to mention a little bit about how that related to the Firebase data sets. Actually, we validated our simulations with the experiments that we can find in the literature. So we validated both against flat ground classical the prescribed fire experiments, and also we validated on some experiments showing on the different slope angles, different wind directions. And we have presented these validation results in our paper together with this Firebase data set. So I think we, from the results we got from the validation data set, in terms of the fire rate of spread, we have over 95% accuracy compared to the experiments. Although there's a lot of uncertainties in the wind and field modeling, but for the overall performance of the fire rate of propagation, we get a pretty good accuracy for doing that.
That's great. Good to hear. Thank you. We do have one more audience question here. This one is another one from Greg. How will real-time infrared data assist in jump-starting your model for real-time support? I mean, Dr. Mahmood, maybe you want to kick that one off.
Yeah, and I can definitely also reflect on that. We, as part of our grant now, working with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation on, a lot of the wildfire work. They asked us a couple of months ago to look at a good number of communities in the U.S. And one of the questions that we started to ask is, which ignition point should we use to determine the boundary of the fire? If you're working at a community scale and you just pick one, you look at a county scale and you pick an ignition point online, the rest of the county might not be in the boundary of the fire. And when you look at existing data, some of them, it was crazy. I mean, I've seen ignition points all over the county. It's like all over the place. So in a wildfire event, if I'm trying to simulate the propagation of the fire in the wildland and inside communities, it's going to be critical to understand where the ignition points or ignition lines might be located. If I'm trying to establish mitigation strategies for the community, I can look at historical ignition points, find what that looks like, and sample, doing a Monte Carlo simulation to do a lot of sampling, in that region, and you run many ignition points, and then you determine what the fire boundaries would look like, and then understand what mitigation needs to happen. But for real-time event data like infrared data would be very, very useful in telling us where should we start the fire, and if multiple ignition points exist or not.
Great. Others on that one? Okay. Actually, we have another last question from the audience. This one is from Abu. Is there any specific devices needed to install in each forest to collect real-time data? And if yes, what's the estimated cost of installing such a device in a medium level forest? How about Dr. Hall? Any thoughts on that one?
So I guess perhaps I could get a little bit of clarity on the question, I suppose, in terms of, when you install a device, essentially what are you wanting to measure? If you're trying to measure, smoke or heat or the sort of characteristics of forests. Yeah, I think currently, at least based on my research, I'm using remote sensing data sets and field measure data sets where people go out with a DBH tape, so a diameter at breast height tape, where you can measure essentially the width of the tree and look at the characteristics of trees, and you relate that to satellites. So there's not necessarily the need for an on-the-ground device. And then the simulation models, it's a mathematical representation of the relationships between forest growth and their interactions with their environment and fire growth and their interactions between forest and fire. So I don't think that there would be any specific devices needed to install it. It's more sort of human-powered measurements for validation.
Got it. And are you finding that the remote sensing data is as accurate as, an in situ device?
Yeah, so based on previous analyses that myself or my colleagues have done and myself in other regions, we are finding a pretty strong relationship between the remote sensing values and what we're measuring in the field. So similar to Dr. Mahmood, we're finding about 70% of the variability. So it's relatively high, nowhere near 95, but 70% is something I think we feel pretty good about.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you, all three of you, so much. You have really given us a lot to think about today, and I think a lot to be hopeful and excited about today. Researchers like yourselves are tackling today's wildfire challenges from all angles: wildland environments, built environments, carbon impacts, and beyond. Leveraging artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning to advance and improve our fire simulation, propagation, and predictive models. We're excited to continue the conversation and learn more about how your research continues to evolve in the future. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. Links to the full recording of today's webinar and any of the resources that we shared will be available on our website following the close of this webinar. And as we continue to build upon this programming, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on today's session, as well as any other topics you'd love for us to focus on. So please take a minute to fill out the survey that I believe Helen just dropped into the chat there, and keep an eye out on our website. It's climateandwildfire.org, or on social at climateandwildfire. And thanks again. Have a lovely smoke-free Wednesday.
Thank you very much for
Thank you very
hosting
much.
this webinar.
Yep,
Thank you
thanks a
very
lot for
much.
the
It's been a
invitation.
pleasure.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.